had been hiking for years, but I always stuck to the safer, well-marked trails. This time, I wanted something harder. I wanted to push myself, test my limits, and do something I could look back on as one of the hardest treks I ever did. When I read about a backcountry ridge trail that crossed a steep mountain range and connected two valleys, I felt drawn to it. It was not part of a popular hiking area, so the information I found online was limited. A few people mentioned it was rough, overgrown, and dangerous if the weather turned bad, but that was exactly the challenge I was looking for. I planned everything down to the last detail. I packed my tent, sleeping bag, water filter, food for 4 days, extra layers, headlamp, trekking poles, first aid kit, a satellite beacon, and enough energy bars to last longer than I needed. I checked the weather forecast, which looked clear, though there was a small chance of rain 2 days in. That didn't worry me too much. I thought I could handle some rain. The morning I started, the trailhead was empty. The dirt road leading up to it was barely drivable, with potholes and rocks scattered everywhere. I parked my car, slung my heavy pack onto my shoulders, and took the first step onto the narrow dirt path. The beginning felt calm. The trees were thick, and the forest smelled fresh with pine and damp soil. My boots crunched over the leaves, and birds called out from high branches. For the first 2 hours, it was just steady uphill climbing. My shirt stuck to my back with sweat, but I kept a good pace. The higher I climbed, the quieter the forest became. The air grew cooler, thinner, and sharper. By late afternoon, I reached a flat spot where I decided to camp for the night. I set up my tent, boiled water, and ate a simple meal of noodles and jerky. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, the air grew cold fast. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and listened to the silence. It was not peaceful silence, though. It was the kind of silence that makes you notice every small crack of a branch or rustle of leaves. I told myself it was just animals moving around and forced myself to sleep. The second day, I left camp early. The trail narrowed into a rough path carved into the side of the mountain. The slope fell sharply to my right, a long drop into the trees below. The ground was uneven, with loose rocks that shifted under my boots. My trekking poles helped, but I still had to move carefully. One bad step could mean sliding down into the ravine. Hours passed like that, slow, careful steps, steady breathing, and constant focus. By midday, I reached the ridge itself. The ground flattened out, but the trail was exposed, with steep drops on both sides. The view was incredible. Endless rows of mountains stretching out into the horizon, their peaks blue with distance. But the beauty didn't erase the danger. Up there, the wind picked up, pushing against me as I walked. Every gust made me tighten my grip on the poles. The trail grew thinner as I continued. Some parts forced me to turn sideways, pressing myself against the rock wall while edging across a ledge barely wide enough for one boot. My heart pounded each time, and sweat trickled down my face. I reminded myself to stay calm, not to look down, and to focus only on the next step. That afternoon, the weather shifted. Clouds rolled in fast, blocking the sun. The wind carried a damp, cold smell that warned of rain. I quickened my pace, knowing wet rock would make everything much more dangerous. Then the rain started. It wasn't a light drizzle. It came heavy and sudden, drenching my clothes, my pack, and the trail beneath me. The rocks turned slick, and water streamed down the slopes. My boots slipped more than once, and I had to drop to my hands and knees to crawl across a section of wet stone. My gloves soaked through, making it harder to grip. Couldn't stop. There was no shelter up there on the ridge. I had to keep moving until I found a flatter spot to camp. But the ridge stretched on, and the rain didn't let up. The clouds dropped lower, wrapping everything in fog so thick I could barely see more than 20 feet ahead. By evening, I was exhausted, soaked, and shaking from the cold. Finally, I spotted a small cluster of trees on a wider section of the ridge. It was barely enough space, but I decided it had to do. I set up my tent with numb fingers, fighting against the wind and rain. My hands shook so badly I could hardly clip the poles into place. By the time I crawled inside, I was shivering so hard my teeth hurt. That night was one of the worst nights of my life. The wind howled around the tent, shaking it so violently I thought it might rip apart. Rain hammered on the fabric. Every time the gusts hit, I imagined myself sliding off the ridge, tent and all, into the blackness below. I didn't sleep much, just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for daylight. When morning came, the storm had passed, but everything was soaked. My gear, my clothes, even my sleeping bag was damp. I forced myself to eat an energy bar and pack up, even though every muscle ached. My legs felt heavy, and my feet were blistered from being wet all night. Still, I kept moving. The ridge trail grew worse the farther I went. Some parts had collapsed, leaving nothing but loose gravel to cross. I had to move slowly, shifting my weight carefully with each step. At one point, a rock gave way under me, and I slid a few feet before stabbing my trekking pole into the ground to stop. My heart pounded so hard I thought I would pass out. I couldn't shake the feeling of being completely alone. I hadn't seen a single person since the trailhead. My phone had no signal. If I got hurt up there, no one would know. That thought stayed in the back of my mind, pressing down on me as much as the weight of my pack. By the third night, I was worn down. I camped again on the ridge, finding a small flat area beside a cluster of rocks. As darkness fell, I noticed how empty the world felt up there. No lights, no sounds of people, nothing but wind moving through the mountains. It wasn't the kind of silence you could relax into. It was the kind that made your thoughts louder, sharper, harder to ignore. I thought about my family, my home, and how far away they were. I thought about what would happen if I made a mistake. I thought about how easy it would be to slip, to vanish without a trace, and how long it might take before anyone even knew I was gone. On the fourth day, the trail finally started to drop off the ridge. My body screamed with every step down, but the thought of reaching the valley kept me going. The trees grew thicker again, the ground less exposed, and I started to believe I might actually make it. Then I reached a section of trail that stopped me cold. A landslide had torn through, leaving a 40-foot gap where the path used to be. In its place was nothing but broken rock and a steep drop. On the far side, I could see where the trail picked up again, but the only way across was to scramble over the loose debris. I sat down and stared at it, my chest tight. My legs were already weak, my balance shaky. One wrong step on that unstable slope and I'd tumble straight down the mountain. But turning back wasn't an option. I didn't have enough food left to climb all the way back over the ridge. The only choice was forward. I tightened my pack, planted my poles, and started across. The rocks shifted under me with every movement. Dust filled my nose and mouth. My boots slid, and my arms burned from gripping the poles so hard. Halfway across, one rock rolled out from under me, and I dropped to my knees. My heart raced, but I forced myself to keep going. When I finally reached the other side, my legs almost gave out from relief. I sat down, shaking, and let myself breathe. The valley stretched out below me, green and endless. For the first time in days, I felt like I might be safe. It still took hours to descend, and my body was on the edge of collapse. My feet bled from blisters, my shoulders ached from the pack, and my stomach cramped from hunger. But I kept moving one slow step at a time. By late evening, I stumbled out of the trees and onto a dirt road. I dropped my pack on the ground and just stood there, staring at the open space. My whole body felt light and heavy at the same time. The danger was finally behind me. I knew I had been lucky. One slip, one bad decision, and I wouldn't have made it off that ridge. The trail had pushed me to my limit and maybe further. I thought I wanted to test myself, to find my edge. I found it, and I realized something standing there on that dirt road. My body shaking, my clothes filthy, my skin raw. Some ridges aren't worth crossing twice. I have always liked hiking alone. Some people say it's risky, but for me it feels clean, quiet, and almost like therapy. When I go out into the woods or mountains, I don't need to think about anything but the trail under my feet, the air filling my lungs, and the sounds of nature moving around me. I don't have to talk, I don't have to listen, and I don't have to keep up with anyone's pace but my own. I take my backpack, a tent, some food, water, and gear, and I disappear into the trees for a few days. That's what I had planned for this trip. The trail I picked wasn't a famous one. It wasn't part of a national park or some heavily advertised scenic loop where people crowd the overlooks. It was one of those routes you find when you read local blogs and old hiking forums. People who had done it mentioned that it was remote, with long stretches where you wouldn't see anyone, and that the terrain was rough in some parts. That was exactly what I wanted. I had been working too much, sitting at my desk for 10 hours a day, staring at a screen. I needed the woods to reset myself. I didn't tell many people where I was going, only left a quick note with the trail name and the day I expected to be back. I thought that was enough. The trailhead was a gravel pull-off next to a narrow forest road. When I arrived, there was only one other car there, a beat-up sedan with mud splashed up the sides. That reassured me in a way. I wouldn't be completely alone out there. Someone else had gone in before me, maybe a day or two earlier. Their car looked like it had been sitting there a while, with pine needles caught in the windshield wipers. I locked my car, adjusted my pack, and started walking. The first few hours were easy. The weather was clear but cool, and the air smelled sharp with pine. The trail followed a river for a while, and I could hear the water rushing fast over rocks. The ground was damp, and my boots left clear prints in the soft dirt. I paid attention to that because I like tracking myself back mentally, knowing what my footprints look like in case I ever get turned around. The forest was thick but not suffocating, with tall pines that let in strips of sunlight. Birds darted around in the canopy, and every now and then a squirrel would run across the path. Felt normal, peaceful. I moved at a steady pace, stopping once or twice to adjust the straps of my pack and drink water. By mid-afternoon, I had put several miles behind me. The trail began to climb slowly, and the forest thinned enough to give me glimpses of distant ridges. My plan was to hike about 12 miles the first day, camp near a lake I had marked on my map, and then push deeper the next day. I wanted to make a loop that would take me 3 full days to finish. The thought of being out there, away from roads and buildings, was exciting, but the feeling started to shift late in the day. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just small details I noticed without meaning to. Around the 6th or 7th mile, I came across footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine, and they weren't fresh either. The edges were softened by wind and a bit of rain, but they were human. Hiking boots, larger than my size, heading the same way I was going. Probably the person with the car at the trailhead. That didn't bother me. What did bother me was that I stopped seeing them after a while. The ground was the same type of soft dirt that should have shown prints for miles, but the tracks just ended. No side trail. No sign that the person had turned off. It was like they had walked into the woods and disappeared. I tried not to think too hard about it. Maybe they had stepped onto the rocks where prints wouldn't show. Maybe I just missed where they left the trail. I told myself it didn't matter. I kept going. The light started to fade, and the air cooled. I felt that mix of calm and urgency that comes with late hiking. Knowing I needed to find a place to camp, but also loving the deepening colors of the woods at dusk. By the time I reached the lake, I was tired but relieved. The water stretched out black and still, with tall grasses at the edges. I found a flat area just above the shoreline and set up my tent. As I cooked a simple meal on my little stove, I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. Lakes usually had insects buzzing, frogs croaking, or at least the sound of water moving. This one was still. The silence pressed on me until I almost wanted to say something out loud just to break it. But of course, I didn't. I ate quickly, packed everything up, and got into my tent. The ground was cold beneath my sleeping pad, and the air smelled wet, like the lake was rotting a little at the edges. I pulled my bag around me and tried to sleep. That night, I woke up several times. The first time was because I thought I heard movement outside. Not big movement like an animal crashing through the woods, but small, slow steps. Something brushing against grass or pine needles. I lay still, holding my breath, listening. It faded after a while, and I convinced myself it was just a deer nosing around. The second time I woke up was stranger. I thought I heard splashing in the water. Not loud, but steady, like someone walking slowly through the shallows. When I unzipped my tent just enough to peek out, the lake was flat and dark. Nothing moved. I closed the tent, but my heart kept beating too hard for me to fall back asleep quickly. In the morning, I told myself it was nerves. The woods can play tricks on you at night. Every little noise feels closer, sharper, heavier. I boiled water for coffee, packed up camp, and set back on the trail. My goal was another 12 to 15 miles with some uphill stretches. The trail wound higher into the ridges, and the trees grew denser again. I didn't see any sign of other people. No boot prints, no broken branches, nothing. The silence stayed with me. Even the birds seemed less active than the day before. By midday, I felt uneasy. It wasn't exhaustion, I was in good shape. It was the sense of being watched. I know that sounds like something people exaggerate, but it was real. My skin prickled, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder again and again. Every time I looked, the trail was empty. The trees stood motionless, and the ground was undisturbed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I sped up without meaning to, eating the miles faster than I planned. My shoulders ached from the pack, but I didn't stop much. Late in the afternoon, I made a mistake. The trail crossed an area of jagged rock, and I lost the markers. For almost half an hour, I scrambled around, trying to find the right way. The sun dipped lower, and I started to panic quietly. If I had to spend the night on that rocky stretch without flat ground for my tent, it would be miserable. Finally, I found the trail again where it dropped back into the trees. Relief washed over me, but it was thin. I had wasted time, and the shadows were already long. I decided to camp sooner than planned. I picked a small clearing about a quarter mile from the trail. It wasn't perfect. Roots bulged under the ground, and the soil was damp, but I was too tired to keep searching. I set up my tent, made a quick meal, and forced myself to eat even though my stomach was tight. Again, the woods were too quiet. I lay down early, trying to convince myself that I would sleep better this time. I didn't. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up to the sound of snapping twigs. Not one or two, several, moving slowly, circling. My chest froze. It was too heavy to be a raccoon or a small animal. It wasn't rushing like a deer. It was careful, deliberate, step by step. I couldn't see anything through the nylon walls of my tent, and I didn't want to move or make noise. My knife was in my pack outside. My bear spray was by my feet, but I couldn't reach it without unzipping my bag. So I just lay there, stiff, my ears straining. The steps moved around for what felt like forever. Then they stopped. I don't remember falling asleep again. Maybe I just passed out from exhaustion. When daylight finally came, I was already awake, staring at the top of the tent. I crawled out slowly, scanning the clearing. Nothing looked disturbed, but when I checked the soft dirt at the edge, I saw prints. Not animal prints. Human, bare feet. The toes were wide, pressed deep into the soil. They circled the clearing, sometimes close to my tent, sometimes farther out. My throat went dry. Whoever it was had been watching me all night. I had been hiking for a few years, but always on marked trails, always on routes where I knew that no matter what happened, I could get back to my car before nightfall. I liked the peace of the woods, the silence that came with being away from traffic and people. That was what pushed me to try something harder. I told myself it was time to take on a longer hike, a trail that would demand more than just a few hours of walking. I picked a mountain route a few hours from where I lived. It wasn't considered extreme, but it wasn't one of those easy tourist paths either. It was the kind of trail where you needed a pack with food, water, and supplies, where you had to watch the daylight and the weather, where you had to be careful not to take a wrong turn. The morning I set out, I woke up before the sun. I packed what I thought I would need: water bottles, granola bars, some fruit, a small camping stove, a rain jacket, a map, a compass, a headlamp, and a first aid kit. I also carried a small knife, mostly out of habit. I checked the weather report. It said clear skies, maybe some wind later in the afternoon. Nothing to worry about. The drive to the trailhead was quiet. I watched the landscape change from small towns to long stretches of road surrounded by forest. The closer I got, the more the air seemed cooler, sharper. The mountain loomed in the distance, not jagged and snow-covered like the ones out west, but tall enough to look serious, dark with thick pine forests. I parked in the gravel lot near the trail entrance. There were a few other cars there already, but not many. That comforted me a little. It meant I wasn't alone on the mountain, but it also meant I wasn't going to be in a crowd. The trail started gently, a wide dirt path lined with ferns and trees. Birds called in the branches above. My boots crunched against loose gravel. The pack sat firm on my shoulders. I felt good, excited even, the way you do when you finally start something you've been thinking about for weeks. The air smelled clean, almost sweet. Sunlight filtered through the trees, making shifting patches of light on the ground. The first couple of hours were easy. The trail was well marked, with orange paint on tree trunks every so often and small wooden signs pointing toward different connecting routes. I kept a steady pace, drinking water often, stopping sometimes just to listen to the forest. A squirrel darted across the trail and disappeared into the underbrush. I saw the faint tracks of deer in the mud where the trail dipped. Everything felt calm. As the morning stretched on, the trail began to climb. It wasn't steep at first, just a slow incline that made my legs work harder. My breathing grew heavier, but I felt strong. The higher I went, the quieter it became. The sounds of the forest changed. The bird calls thinned out. The trees grew closer together. The wind moved differently through the branches. I passed a small stream where the water ran over mossy rocks. I crouched down, splashed cold water on my face, and ate a granola bar. It was after midday when I came to a fork. The map I carried showed two options. The left path was longer, winding around the side of the mountain before looping back toward the main trail. The right path was shorter, steeper, but it cut directly upward and reconnected higher on the ridge. I hesitated. The longer route seemed safer, but I had the energy and wanted the challenge. I chose the steep path. First, it was fine. The trail narrowed, but it was still clear. The trees thinned out, and I could see further down the slope when I looked back. The air cooled as I climbed higher. The ground was rockier, the roots thicker, twisting up like ropes. I had to watch each step more carefully. After about an hour of climbing, I noticed the trail markers weren't as frequent. I passed one orange mark on a tree, then I walked for what felt like too long without seeing another. I slowed down, scanning trunks as I went. I told myself not to worry. Sometimes the markers were just spaced out more. But a small knot of unease formed in my stomach. When I finally came across another mark, I felt relief, though it was faded, almost scratched off. I kept going. The trail seemed less maintained here, narrower, with sections that looked like they had been washed out by rain. I had to step over fallen branches and skirt patches of loose gravel. The slope grew sharper. I used my hands at times, grabbing roots or rocks to steady myself. By late afternoon, the trail flattened briefly at a ridge. From there, I could see across the valley, a long stretch of dark forest falling away below me. The sun was lower, the light softer. I realized I had been hiking for hours and still hadn't reconnected with the main trail like the map had promised. I pulled the map from my pack, unfolded it carefully, and tried to line up where I was. But the more I stared, the less certain I felt. The curves of the path didn't quite match. I knew I had taken the steep shortcut, but the details seemed off. I decided to keep moving forward, figuring the trail had to connect somewhere. But soon, the path beneath my boots became harder to follow. It broke into patches of bare dirt, then into loose rock, then into forest floor that looked like it could have been anything. I stopped, turned in a slow circle, and felt a cold rush through my chest. The trail was gone. At first, I thought I could backtrack. I turned around and walked the way I thought I had come, but after a few minutes, the ground looked the same in every direction. The trees pressed close, the slope tilted, and I couldn't find the broken branches or footprints I expected. My breath quickened. I forced myself to stop and think. Panic, I knew, would only make it worse. I sat down on a flat rock and took out my compass. North was clear enough, but the map still confused me. I tried to match ridges and valleys, but the forest swallowed everything. Nothing looked like the neat lines on the paper. I stuffed the map away, drank some water, and told myself I needed to stay calm. The light shifted fast. The sun was sinking, and the woods darkened. The air grew cooler with a damp edge. I took out my headlamp, checked the batteries, and strapped it on my forehead. I still thought I could find the trail if I searched carefully. I walked slowly, marking trees with small scratches from my knife so I could find my way back if needed. But the woods were endless. Every tree looked the same. The scratches I made felt too small, too easy to miss. My legs grew tired, my throat dry. When I stopped again, it hit me fully. I was lost, truly lost. The trail was gone, the map was useless, and night was coming. I forced myself to think about what to do. I had some supplies. I could stay put for the night, build a small fire, and wait until morning to try again. That seemed like the safest option. Moving in the dark would only make things worse. I chose a flat area near a cluster of rocks, cleared leaves, and gathered dry sticks. It took time, but with the small stove and a lighter, I managed to spark a flame. Soon, a small fire crackled, giving off just enough warmth and light to push back the darkness. The forest at night was a different world. The firelight made the trees look taller, their shadows twisting on the ground. The sounds grew louder. I heard things moving in the underbrush, the snap of twigs, the call of distant animals. Each noise made me stiffen, listening, but I couldn't see far past the glow of the flames. My stomach knotted with hunger, but I forced down some food, chewing slowly, barely tasting it. The hours crawled. The fire sank low, and I fed it sticks to keep it alive. Sleep came in uneasy bursts. I would doze, then jerk awake at the sound of something shifting nearby. Once, I thought I saw eyes reflecting in the darkness, but when I blinked, they were gone. Morning came cold and pale. My fire had burned to ash. My body ached from the hard ground. I ate a small breakfast, packed my things, and tried again. I decided to move downhill. I remembered reading that if you're lost, following water can lead you to people. Streams ran down to rivers, and rivers led to towns. I walked slowly, checking each step, careful not to slip. The slope grew steeper, and I grabbed trees to steady myself. Hours passed. My water supply was running low. The sun climbed high, but the thick trees blocked much of its light. At last, I heard the faint sound of water. I pushed through thick brush until I found a narrow stream trickling over stones. Relief washed over me. I knelt, refilled my bottles, and drank deeply, the cold water shocking my throat. I followed the stream. At first it was easy, but soon the banks grew rough, choked with brambles and fallen logs. I fought my way along, scratched and sweating. My legs shook with exhaustion. Still, I pressed on, convinced it would lead me out. By late afternoon, I realized the stream was only winding deeper into the forest. The valley grew steeper, darker, and the water cut into a small gorge that I couldn't follow. I stood there, heart sinking. I couldn't climb further down safely, and I couldn't keep wasting strength. I had to find another way. The second night was worse. I built another fire, smaller this time because my sticks were damp. I had been planning the hike for weeks. The idea of being out in the quiet of the mountains, away from cars, phones, and the endless noise of the city, was something I looked forward to. I wanted the stillness, the kind of silence where even the smallest sound of a bird or the crunch of leaves under boots feels sharp in the air. I packed everything carefully: my backpack, tent, food, water, extra layers, a knife, map, compass, and a headlamp. I knew the trail was known to be difficult, but I told myself that was the point. I wanted to test myself to see how far I could push. The morning I left, the air was cool. The trailhead was empty, which I liked. I had read that not many people took this particular route because it was long and isolated. The dirt path wound its way up through trees that grew tall and close together. The leaves shifted gently in the light wind, and the forest smelled of damp earth and pine. My boots crunched against gravel, and I could hear the soft rhythm of my breathing. For the first hour, it felt almost peaceful. The ground climbed steadily, and I found my body warming with the effort. My backpack pressed heavy against my shoulders, but I had trained for this, walked long distances in the weeks leading up to it, so I told myself I could manage. As the trees grew denser, the light dimmed. Sunlight came down in broken pieces through the branches, making long shadows stretch across the ground. I checked my map at a fork and kept to the right. The higher I went, the more the forest closed in. The sounds of birds faded. Even the wind seemed softer, as if the trees swallowed the noise. I kept walking, pushing up rocky switchbacks, climbing over roots, taking careful steps where the ground dipped and grew slick. Every so often, I would pause to drink water, my ears open for movement. Once or twice, I thought I heard something far behind me, a stick breaking, the kind of sharp snap that doesn't come from wind or falling leaves. I stopped, turned, looked back down the trail. There was no one, just the empty path twisting back into the woods. I shook it off and kept moving. By midday, my legs were starting to burn from the climb. I found a flat spot where the trees opened slightly and dropped my pack. I ate a protein bar and some dried fruit, sitting on a rock and staring out into the woods. The silence was heavy. I realized then how far I was from everything. No houses, no cars, no voices. Just miles of trees pressing close, endless green and brown stretching out in all directions. I should have found it peaceful, but instead it left me uneasy. When I stood to move again, I felt it, the sense of being watched. It was faint at first, a kind of weight between my shoulder blades. I turned again, scanning the woods. My eyes moved over trunks, branches, shadows. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake it. I adjusted my pack, tightened the straps, and told myself it was just nerves. The trail grew steeper in the afternoon. Loose rocks slid under my boots, and I had to use my hands at points to climb. Sweat dripped down my neck. My breathing grew louder in my ears. Then I heard it again, the sharp crack of a branch behind me. My head snapped around. The forest was still. My heart was beating hard. I listened for more, holding my breath, but there was nothing. Finally, I forced myself to keep going, though I found myself glancing back more often, scanning the trees every few minutes. By the time the sun began to dip, I knew I had to set up camp. I found a small clearing off the trail and dropped my pack. The air was cooler now, the shadows long. I unrolled my tent quickly, staking it into the ground. I gathered some fallen branches and dry wood and got a small fire going. The flames popped softly, sending smoke curling up into the dimming sky. I ate in silence. The fire cracked. The forest around me was silent too, unnaturally so. Usually, even at dusk, I'd expect to hear insects, maybe an owl, but there was nothing. Just the sound of my fire and my own chewing. I kept glancing out past the firelight, staring at the wall of dark trees. My stomach twisted with unease. That night, I lay in my tent, my sleeping bag pulled tight around me. The fire outside had burned down to glowing coals, the faint light barely seeping through the fabric. The forest was so quiet it almost rang in my ears. My body was tired, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something. Faint steps on the leaves, a rustle, the low crack of a twig. My heart would pound and I'd hold still, listening. Nothing followed, just silence. Hours must have passed before I finally dozed off. But it wasn't deep sleep. I woke again and again, straining to hear. Once, I swore I heard breathing outside the tent. Not animal breathing, steady, controlled, human. My skin went cold. I held my knife in my hand inside the sleeping bag and didn't move, barely breathing myself. I lay like that for what felt like forever, until the faint light of dawn began to show through the fabric. When I stepped out of the tent in the morning, the clearing looked the same. But then I saw it, the faint impression of footprints in the dirt, just beyond the edge of my fire ring. They were too big for an animal. They looked like boots. My chest tightened. I stared at them, the air cold in my lungs. I packed fast that morning, hardly eating. I doused the coals with water and kicked dirt over them. Then I shouldered my pack and got back on the trail. I didn't want to stay another minute. My plan had been to hike deeper, to stay 2 or 3 nights, but that idea was gone. I decided I would head back down before dark. The trail seemed different on the way down. Every sound made me jump. A bird taking off from a branch felt too loud. A squirrel running through the leaves sounded like heavy steps. I kept turning, scanning behind me. Several times I thought I caught a flicker of movement through the trees, but when I focused, there was nothing. Midday came and I stopped briefly for water. That was when I saw it again. On the dirt of the trail, not far behind me, were more footprints. Fresh. I hadn't passed anyone all morning. The hair rose on the back of my neck. Someone was following me. I didn't run, but I walked faster, my eyes darting everywhere. The silence pressed heavier now, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. I climbed down switchbacks, my knees aching, sweat dampening my shirt. Once, far above on the ridge, I thought I saw a figure. Just for a second. Tall, standing still among the trees. My heart pounded hard, but when I looked again, there was only shadows. The trail felt endless. My legs burned, my throat dry. I forced myself to keep going, pushing down the fear that clawed at me. Every time I slowed, I thought I heard it, the faint crunch of steps matching mine, never too close, never too far. By late afternoon, I finally saw the sign of the trailhead through the trees. Relief flooded me. I pushed harder, my boots slamming the dirt, sweat dripping into my eyes. When I stepped out into the small gravel lot where my car was parked, I felt like I could finally breathe. The lot was empty, just as it had been when I arrived. I dropped my pack onto the ground and unlocked my car with shaky hands. I loaded my gear fast, glancing back at the tree line over and over. I thought for just a moment I saw movement there, the faint outline of someone standing still between the trunks, watching. I got in the car and slammed the doors locked. My hands were trembling as I started the engine. Gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled out of the lot and down the long road away from the trail. Only when the forest finally disappeared in the rearview mirror did my breathing ease. I never went back to that trail. I told myself I had imagined some of it, that maybe the footprints were old, maybe the sounds were animals. But deep down, I knew the truth. Someone had been out there, following me through the silence, watching me all night. If I had stayed another night, I don't know what would have happened. I had been hiking for years, but this trip was supposed to be a simple one. I planned it on my own, late in the fall season, when the air was colder, the days shorter, and fewer people were out on the trails. I always liked being alone in nature. It felt like a way to reset my mind, to step away from the noise of the world. But sometimes the very thing you go to find peace in can turn against you, and I would learn that on this trip. I started my hike early in the morning, just after sunrise. The trail was tucked away in a less popular section of the national forest, miles away from the busier parts where most families and casual hikers went. I had picked this one because it was marked as strenuous on the map with narrow paths and elevation gain, and I wanted the challenge. It was a loop trail about 15 miles, and I figured with the daylight I had, I could do it in one long push if I kept a steady pace. I carried a pack with food, water, a flashlight, a map, a compass, a knife, and a thin emergency blanket, just the basics. I wasn't planning to camp, just hike it in a day and head back to my car. The morning air was crisp and sharp in my lungs. My boots crunched on the leaf litter, the sound loud in the otherwise silent forest. The trail was covered in shades of brown, red, and orange from the fallen leaves, with a thin layer of frost in the shaded spots. The trees stood tall and bare, their branches like skeletal arms reaching into the pale sky. The first few miles went smoothly. I felt good, my legs strong, my pace steady. But as I got deeper into the woods, I noticed how quickly the trail narrowed. The markers became less frequent. There were long stretches where I had to really search for the faded paint on tree trunks or small piles of rocks that showed the way. I kept checking the map, tracing my finger along the lines, making sure I was on the loop. It seemed fine, but I had a nagging feeling that the path wasn't as well kept as I had expected. Around midday, I stopped on a ridge to eat some food. From where I sat, I could see miles of rolling forest below, an endless carpet of bare trees stretching out in every direction. There was no sign of roads, no cabins, no other people. The silence was heavy. After eating, I packed up and pushed on. The trail dropped steeply after the ridge, twisting down into a hollow where the ground was soft and damp. The air was colder there, the sunlight barely reaching through the trees. I moved carefully, using my poles for balance. The hollow stretched on longer than I thought it would, and by the time I climbed out the other side, I realized I had lost more time than planned. I checked my watch and felt a flicker of unease. I still had a long way to go, and the sun was already starting to sink lower in the sky. I pushed harder, my breath coming out in white clouds. The trail rose again, this time steeper, with loose rocks and roots. My thighs burned, but I kept going. I told myself I just needed to make it to the next marker. But as I climbed higher, the markers seemed to disappear altogether. I stopped, turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees for the faded paint or rock piles. Nothing, just trees and silence. I pulled out my map and compass. According to the map, the trail curved east along the ridge. If I kept my compass steady and followed east, I should hit it again. I started moving carefully, keeping my eyes sharp, but after 20 minutes, I still hadn't seen a single sign. That's when I realized I might be off the trail completely. The first wave of fear hit me then, heavy and sharp in my stomach. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I'd find the path again if I kept steady. I turned back, trying to retrace my steps, but the ground was covered in leaves, and every tree looked the same. The more I looked, the more lost I felt. The sun was sinking fast now. The woods were filling with long shadows, and the temperature dropped quickly. I pulled on my jacket and decided to stop walking in circles. Instead, I climbed a slope to try and get a better view. From the top, I could see more ridges, more endless forest, the horizon already painted with the orange of sunset. Still no sign of the trail. Panic started pressing harder at the edges of my mind. I forced myself to think clearly. I had food, water, a flashlight, and an emergency blanket. I could last the night out here if I had to. I just needed to find a safe spot before it got too dark. I picked a small flat area between two thick trees and cleared the leaves away. I sat down, pulling the emergency blanket around me. The forest around me grew darker and darker until it was almost pitch black. The silence changed with nightfall. During the day, it had felt peaceful, but now it was suffocating. Every sound stood out: branches snapping, leaves crunching, the distant call of an animal. I sat there for hours, shivering, my ears straining at every noise. I didn't sleep. My flashlight beam cut through the dark when I thought I heard something close, but each time it was just more trees, more emptiness. When the sky finally began to lighten again, I was exhausted. My body was stiff from the cold, my stomach tight with hunger. I ate a little, drank some water, and told myself I needed to move. Sitting there wouldn't help. I folded the blanket, packed up, and started walking east again. The second day was worse. My legs were sore, my head ached, and my throat was dry. I kept glancing at the compass, trying to hold my direction, but the ridges and hollows kept throwing me off. I slipped on rocks, tripped over roots, and each time I got back up, the frustration built. I shouted once, just out of anger, my voice cracking in the empty woods. It echoed faintly and then disappeared. By midday, I found a creek. Relief washed over me. I knelt, filled my bottle, and drank deeply. I remembered from the map that the loop trail crossed a creek at some point. Maybe this was it. My hope came back, and I decided to follow the water downstream. If nothing else, it might lead to a larger river or a road. I followed the creek for hours, stumbling along the uneven banks. But the more I followed it, the deeper into the forest it seemed to go. The trees closed in tighter, the ground soggier. My feet were soaked from slipping in the water. Still no sign of a trail, no bridge, no markings. That night, I found a spot near the creek to sit again. I was more tired than the first night, my stomach gnawing with hunger. I chewed slowly on the little food I had left, trying to stretch it. The noises in the woods seemed closer this time. I thought I heard footsteps once, but when I shined the flashlight, there was nothing. I stayed awake most of the night again, my nerves stretched thin. The third day, I knew I was in trouble. My food was almost gone, my body weak, and my mind foggy from lack of sleep. I kept walking, pushing through brush, climbing ridges, sliding down slopes, always searching for a sign of the trail. Nothing came, just endless trees. Late that afternoon, I reached another ridge and looked out again. Far away, almost hidden in the trees, I saw a straight line that didn't look natural. My heart jumped. It was too straight to be part of the forest. I forced my aching legs to move toward it, stumbling down the ridge, through thickets and mud. When I finally broke through, I saw it clearly. An old logging road, overgrown, covered in weeds, but still a road. Relief nearly dropped me to my knees. I followed it, barely able to keep moving, every step heavy. But the thought of being found kept me going. The road twisted on for miles. The sun was sinking again, the light fading. My legs felt like they might give out at any moment. But just as darkness started to fall, I saw something ahead, a metal gate across the road, and beyond it, the faint shape of a larger gravel road. I stumbled to it, leaned against the gate, and let out a sound that was half a laugh, half a sob. I was out. I was going to live. Took another hour before a truck finally came down that gravel road. I waved my arms wildly, and the driver stopped, his eyes wide as he took me in. I must have looked awful, dirty, pale, exhausted. He let me climb in, and for the first time in days, I felt safe. Later, when I thought about it, I realized how close I had been to not making it. A wrong step, a bad fall, one more night without food, and I might not have walked out at all. I had gone into the woods thinking I was prepared, but I had underestimated just how unforgiving nature could be. That trip changed the way I hiked forever. Now I carry more gear. I stick to trails I know are well marked. I tell people exactly where I'm going. I learned the hard way that the woods don't care about your plans. If you make a mistake, you pay for it. And as much as I still love hiking, I never forget those 3 nights I spent alone, lost, with nothing but the dark woods pressing in on me. I had been planning the hike for weeks. The route I picked was not famous or crowded, which was the main reason I chose it. I wanted quiet. I wanted space away from people, roads, and phone signals. The trail cut through a stretch of mountains that weren't popular with tourists, and the information I could find about it online was limited. Most of what I pieced together came from old topographic maps and scattered posts on obscure hiking forums. A few mentioned that the trail was long, rough, and often overgrown, but they also said it was rewarding because you could go for days without seeing another human being. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed for 5 days. My pack was heavy, maybe too heavy, but I thought I had done a good job balancing weight with supplies. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, enough food, a filter for water, a small first aid kit, a headlamp with extra batteries, and layers of clothing for warmth. I had my knife, a can of bear spray even though I doubted I'd see one out there, and a power bank for emergencies. My boots were broken in. I had been running and doing hikes nearby for months, so I felt ready. The first morning was cool when I parked my car at the rough trailhead. The gravel road leading there had been uneven and almost washed out in places, but I made it. The sun was low, golden, and there was a silence that felt thick around the trees. The trail started clearly enough, though it looked like few people had set foot there in a long time. Fallen leaves, broken branches, and moss covered the ground, and the wooden sign marking the start was faded almost beyond reading. The first day passed smoothly. The trail followed a river upstream for miles, sometimes close enough to hear it rushing, sometimes only faint in the distance. I stopped often to adjust my pack straps, drink, and look around. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear any voices or distant car sounds, just the water, the wind, and the occasional cry of a bird. As the sun started dipping, I set up my tent on a flat spot above the river, filtered water, cooked some dehydrated food, and sat watching the light fade between the trunks. I slept light but steady, waking now and then at the sound of branches snapping or something rustling, but it was always nothing, just the forest being alive. The second day was harder. The trail began climbing away from the river into denser woods. The air was cooler and damp, and the ground soft from old rain. I noticed how narrow the path became, sometimes barely more than a depression in the earth. Bushes crowded close. In places, fallen trees forced me to crawl or walk around, which slowed me down. By midday, my legs burned, and sweat soaked my shirt even though the air was cold. I passed a small clearing with a rotting wooden post sticking out of the ground, maybe an old trail marker. It looked forgotten, leaning at an angle. I remember pausing there longer than I needed to, catching my breath and wondering when the last time anyone had stood in that spot. That night, I set up camp on a ridge. From there, I could see the rolling ridgelines of the mountains stretching away, dark blue and fading into each other. I didn't see any sign of other hikers, no fires in the distance, no movement. I was completely alone, and it filled me with both peace and a small thread of unease I didn't want to admit. On the third day, things started changing. The trail became rougher, steeper, and harder to follow. In some places, it vanished completely, covered by rocks that had slid down the slope or by years of growth swallowing it. I relied on the map and compass more than before, and more than once I had to backtrack to make sure I hadn't strayed. My pack felt heavier, my shoulders ached, and blisters began forming on my heels despite my socks. Still, I pressed on, telling myself that this was what I had come for. Isolation, challenge, the feeling of being far from everything. That afternoon, while moving down a long descent into a valley, I noticed boot prints in a patch of soft earth. They weren't fresh, maybe days old, but they were there. The sight of them struck me in a way I didn't expect. On one hand, it was proof that someone else had been here not long ago. On the other hand, I had read that hardly anyone used this route anymore. It was strange, unsettling in a quiet way. I couldn't stop thinking about it as I kept moving. By the fourth day, I was feeling the fatigue. My food was running lower than I wanted, and I realized I might have miscalculated my pace. My legs were slower, and I stopped more often to rest. The weather shifted, too. Clouds pressed in, heavy and gray, and a light drizzle started falling by noon. The trail in places became mud, slippery and sucking at my boots. That night, I made camp earlier than usual in a patch of woods that felt darker than the ones before. The drizzle had turned into steady rain, pattering on the fly of my tent. I was sore, wet, and tired, and I barely ate before crawling into my bag. Sometime in the night, I woke suddenly, heart pounding, because I was certain I had heard something close to my tent. It wasn't the rain or the usual rustle of small animals. It had been deliberate, a crunch of a footstep in wet leaves. I held my breath, listening hard, but heard nothing else. After minutes stretched long, I convinced myself it was just my imagination and fell back asleep. The next morning, the ground around my tent was disturbed. At first, I thought it was just rainwater carving small channels, but then I saw it clearer. A footprint in the mud. Not mine. It wasn't fresh, edges softened by rain, but it was there, inches from where my tent had been staked. I stood staring at it for a long time, the sound of my blood loud in my ears. The footprint looked like a hiking boot, maybe similar in size to mine, but the fact that it had been so close, right outside my tent, made my chest tighten. Someone had been there in the night. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was old, from before I set up camp, and the rain had simply made it look newer. Maybe I hadn't noticed it while pitching the tent. But no matter how I tried to frame it, unease spread in me. I packed quickly and moved on. My pace was faster than before, driven more by nerves than energy. Every sound in the forest seemed sharper now, every crack of a branch in the distance pulling my eyes. The trail led through narrow cuts of land, where slopes rose steep on both sides, and I felt exposed, like something could be watching from above. By midday, I reached a long, rocky section where the trail climbed along the side of a ridge. The footing was uneven, and I had to use my hands to steady myself. When I stopped to drink, I looked back and thought I saw movement on the trail behind me, far down the slope, a flash of dark, something upright. When I blinked and stared, there was nothing. The thought of being followed wouldn't leave me. I kept glancing back, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, that it was just the mind playing tricks after days alone. But the feeling of being watched was constant. That night, I didn't sleep much. I set my tent in a thicket, hidden as best I could, and lay awake listening. My stomach felt tight, my muscles tense. Hours seemed to crawl by with only the faint drip of water from leaves. But then, sometime past midnight, I heard it again. A sound of movement. Not close this time, but faint and steady. The crunch of steps, then a pause, then more steps. I stayed frozen, every nerve on edge. The sound came and went, always far enough away that I couldn't be certain, but close enough that I knew it wasn't just the forest shifting. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to announce themselves. At dawn, I broke camp fast and started walking, my eyes scanning constantly. My food was down to 2 meals and a few snacks. I had planned to loop back toward the car on the 5th day, but I was behind schedule. If I didn't push hard, I'd run out before reaching the trailhead. The hike that day was grueling. Steep climbs, long drops, slick mud, and the constant pressure of paranoia. I checked behind me so often it slowed me down, but I couldn't stop myself. At one point, while crossing a stream, I looked at the muddy bank and saw fresh prints. They weren't mine. They were pointed the same way I was headed. Whoever it was had passed not long ago. I felt both relief and dread. Relief because maybe it meant they weren't following me. They were simply ahead. Dread because it meant I wasn't imagining it. Someone else was out here, moving along the same forgotten path. As the light faded that evening, I pushed on longer than I should have, desperate to put more distance between myself and whoever it was. My legs shook with exhaustion, but the fear of stopping outweighed it. Eventually, I found a flat spot and pitched my tent in near darkness. I barely ate, just collapsed into the bag, shivering with cold and nerves. That night was the worst. I woke to the sound of snapping wood. Close. My breath caught, and I lay still, ears straining. There it was again. Slow steps circling outside. Not rushing, not stumbling. Careful. I gripped the bear spray in my hand and didn't move. My mouth was dry, my heartbeat heavy. The steps lingered, then faded slowly into the distance. I lay awake until dawn, my hands still clenched around the can. I had been planning this hike for weeks. It wasn't the longest or most dangerous trail I could have picked, but it was a serious one, and I knew it would test me. The area was known for steep climbs, loose rock, sudden weather changes, and long stretches where you wouldn't see another soul for hours. That was part of the attraction. I liked the idea of disappearing into the wild, carrying only what I needed on my back, and testing myself against the elements. The morning I set out, the sky was pale and clear, the kind of quiet blue that usually means you'll have a good stretch of weather. My backpack felt heavy, though I had packed carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a small stove, extra layers, and a map tucked safely in a plastic bag. I had hiked before, but this trip was longer and more remote than anything I'd done alone. I told myself I was ready. The first hours passed easily. The trail was a mix of hard dirt and stone, weaving through thick trees. I enjoyed the rhythm of walking, the crunch of boots on soil, the steady sound of my own breath. Birds darted across the trail, the air was cool, and for a while I felt calm. I stopped a couple of times to drink water and eat a handful of nuts, then kept moving. The forest eventually thinned, and the path began to climb. I could see the line of mountains in the distance. That was where I was heading. By midday, I was sweating hard, my shirt sticking to my back, my thighs burning from the uphill climb. I forced myself to keep a steady pace. I didn't want to push too hard early on, but I also didn't want to lose daylight. At one point, I checked the map against the trail marker. Everything matched. I told myself I was on schedule, but as the hours wore on, the trail grew rougher. Loose gravel made me slip, roots caught my boots, and the trees grew sparse until I was hiking mostly in open sun. My water started to go faster than I liked. I tried to sip instead of gulp, but my mouth was always dry. By the time the sun was leaning toward the west, I was looking for a flat place to camp. I found a small clearing just off the trail, tucked against a line of boulders. I dropped my pack, set up the tent, and cooked a simple meal of noodles. I ate slowly, listening to the quiet. The silence was heavy in a way that made me feel both peaceful and uneasy. I crawled into my tent before it was even dark, telling myself I needed the rest. That night, though, I didn't sleep well. Every small sound outside, branches snapping, the rustle of wind through leaves, kept me half awake. I kept telling myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or some small creature. Still, my body stayed tense. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of walking endless switchbacks that never ended. In the morning, I packed quickly and pushed on. The air was cooler, and thin clouds stretched across the sky. The trail grew steeper. My legs ached, and every step felt heavier. By the second day, I noticed I was moving slower than I had planned. I checked the map again, realizing I might not reach the lake I had planned to camp near before nightfall. I told myself it was fine. I had food, water, and my tent. There were plenty of places to stop along the way. But late in the afternoon, as I climbed a narrow ridge, I felt the first hint of trouble. The wind picked up, pushing against me in sharp bursts. The sky darkened in a way that didn't match the forecast. I pulled on a jacket and kept going, but unease settled in my stomach. By the time I found a flat spot, the wind was howling hard enough to shake the trees. I wrestled with the tent, staking it down as best I could. My fingers grew clumsy in the cold, and by the time I crawled inside, I was shivering. That night was worse than the first. The wind never stopped. It slammed against the tent walls, rattled the poles, and whistled through the rocks. I lay awake, heart racing, imagining the whole tent being ripped away and leaving me exposed in the dark. My water supply was running low. I had enough food, but my throat burned with thirst. I tried to sleep, but it came in broken stretches. The next morning, when I unzipped the tent, the world looked different. Fog hung low over the trees, and the trail was slick with mud. I felt sore, tired, and uneasy. I told myself I just had to keep moving forward, get to the lake, refill my bottles, and rest. But as I hiked, something felt wrong. The trail markers grew harder to spot. Some were faded, others blocked by fallen branches. I stopped often to check the map, but the fog made it hard to judge distance. I pressed on, convincing myself I was still on track. At one point, I realized I hadn't seen a marker in a long while. The trail under my boots looked less worn, narrower, almost overgrown. I crouched to check the dirt, no fresh boot prints. My stomach dropped. I pulled out the map again, tracing the lines with my finger, but the shapes of the land around me didn't seem to match. I had wandered off. I stood there for a long moment, fighting panic. My chest felt tight, my hands trembling. I forced myself to breathe. I told myself I could backtrack, find the last marker, and set things right. I turned around and started walking. First, I thought it would be simple, but the fog twisted everything. Rocks and trees looked the same. I walked for what felt like hours, scanning every tree for paint, every rock for a sign. Nothing. My water bottle was almost empty now, and my lips were cracked. When the sun sank low again, I realized I was in serious trouble. I was off trail, tired, thirsty, and alone. I found a small flat patch among the trees and set up the tent again. My stomach growled, but I could barely eat. My mind kept spinning with the thought of being lost. I told myself rescue would come if it got bad, but I hadn't told anyone the exact trail I planned to hike. I had only said I was going into the mountains. That thought made my blood run cold. The next day, I tried again. I packed camp quickly and moved with purpose, trying to retrace my steps. But the terrain grew harsher. Slopes dropped steeply, and gullies cut the land into confusing lines. I slipped often, catching myself on roots and rocks. My ankles ached, and my shoulders throbbed from the pack. By noon, I was moving slower and slower, my throat raw from thirst. Then came the worst moment. I slipped on loose gravel and went down hard. My knee smashed against a rock, sending a hot wave of pain up my leg. I sat there, gasping, clutching at it. Blood welled from a scrape, and the joint throbbed with every attempt to move. For a while, I just sat there, staring at the ground, feeling utterly small and broken. But I couldn't stay there. I forced myself to stand, testing the knee. It hurt badly, but I could still put weight on it. I limped forward, each step sending a sharp sting through me. My body felt weak, my mind clouded with fear. The hours blurred together after that. I stumbled through brush, over rocks, down narrow animal paths. I drank the last of my water by mid-afternoon and felt panic rising with the dryness in my mouth. I started licking moisture off leaves, scooping handfuls of muddy runoff just to wet my tongue. My stomach cramped, but I didn't care. That night, I barely managed to pitch the tent. My hands shook, and I had to stop often to catch my breath. I lay inside, knee throbbing, mouth dry, listening to the endless silence of the forest. It was no longer peaceful. It was crushing, pressing in from all sides, reminding me how far I was from help. The next morning, I woke weak and dizzy. My body screamed for water. My head pounded. I forced myself to pack and keep moving. Every step felt like a battle. At one point, I thought I saw a break in the trees, a slope leading down to what might be a stream. I stumbled toward it, nearly falling, and finally, blessedly, I heard the faint sound of running water. I collapsed beside the stream, plunging my hands into the cold flow, drinking until my stomach hurt. I stayed there a long time, filling my bottles, splashing my face, trying to gather the strength to go on. For the first time in days, I felt a small flicker of hope. I followed the stream downstream, figuring it would eventually lead to something, a larger river, a road, maybe even people. The going was slow, the ground uneven, but at least I had water now. It took another 2 days of limping, stumbling, and pushing through brush before I saw the first real sign of hope. A cut log, clearly made by a saw, lying near the stream. My chest lifted. That meant humans had been here. I followed the stream further and eventually spotted what looked like a rough trail cutting across it. I turned onto that path, dragging myself forward. The trail was faint but real. My heart pounded as I forced myself to keep moving, despite exhaustion screaming in every muscle. Finally, late in the afternoon, I saw it. A dirt road winding through the trees. I dropped to my knees, tears stinging my eyes. Relief washed over me so strongly I thought I might. I had been hiking for years, but most of the time my trips were short and close to home. I had always wanted to take on something bigger, something that would really test me. That is how I ended up driving west for hours one summer morning to hike a long canyon trail that I had read about online. The trail cut through a wide desert canyon with sandstone walls, winding paths, narrow passages, and dry creek beds that stretched for miles. People said it was beautiful but also harsh, with little shade and no cell service once you got deep enough. That warning made it sound even more appealing to me. I packed carefully. In my backpack I had 3 bottles of water, some energy bars, a flashlight, an extra battery pack for my phone, a basic first aid kit, a lighter, and a thin jacket that I tied to the bottom straps. My boots were sturdy but worn in. I carried a paper map I had printed the night before, though the lines and landmarks on it were vague. I figured as long as I stayed on the main trail and paid attention to where I was going, I would be fine. I planned to hike deep into the canyon, take a long loop, and make it back to the trailhead by evening. When I parked at the trailhead lot that morning, the sun was already bright, and the heat hit me hard as soon as I stepped out of the car. I signed the little trail register near the board, wrote my name and the time, and started off with my pack secure on my shoulders. At first, the trail was wide and clear. The canyon walls rose higher as I walked in, and the sound of the highway faded. Soon all I heard was the crunch of my boots on the dry dirt and the occasional call of a bird echoing off the rock. The scenery was incredible. Red rock walls, layers of stone that looked painted, caves carved into the sides by years of wind, and dry stream beds that snaked along the bottom. The deeper I went, the narrower the canyon got in places. Then it would open into wide chambers where the sun poured down and made everything glow orange. I took pictures at first, but after a while I just walked and looked around. Hours passed, and the trail became less obvious. In some places it broke into faint paths split by rocks, and I had to stop and study the ground to see where the boot prints led. I looked back often to remember how the trail twisted, just in case. I told myself I was paying attention. At midday, I stopped in the shadow of a tall wall and ate an energy bar. The heat was already punishing. I drank half of one bottle of water, saving the rest. My plan was still solid. Hike another few hours, take the loop, and be back by sunset. But as the afternoon dragged on, the canyon floor grew more confusing. I passed a section where floodwaters must have rushed through in the past, because the ground was churned and rough, with fallen branches and sand piled high. The main path seemed to vanish into it. I followed what looked like boot prints into a narrow side passage, sure it would connect back to the loop. That was my first mistake. The passage bent sharply and grew tighter, forcing me to turn sideways in some spots. The walls rose straight up, shutting out most of the light. My pack scraped against the rock as I squeezed through. At last the passage opened again into a small basin, but I realized I could no longer see any clear trail markers. I pulled out my folded paper map, but the basin wasn't labeled. It was just a blank space between two bends of the canyon. I stood there for a long minute, the silence pressing down. I could hear nothing but my own breathing and the faint buzz of insects. I decided to keep moving forward, sure the trail would reappear. I walked another hour, checking the map again and again, but every turn looked the same. Sandstone walls, dry washouts, patches of scrub brush. The sky above shifted as the sun dropped lower, and the shadows grew longer. I finally admitted to myself that I was off the main trail. My water was going down faster than I had planned. I drank the last of the first bottle and stuffed the empty plastic into my pack. The heat had drained me, and sweat soaked my shirt. I thought about turning around and retracing my steps, but the canyon twists all looked alike now. I tried, walking back the way I thought I had come, only to find myself in another chamber I didn't recognize. That was when the fear began to creep in. I told myself not to panic. I still had 2 bottles of water, a flashlight, food, and time. The worst case, I thought, was that I would hike until it got dark, then sleep on the ground and try again in the morning. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was farther out than I realized. By late afternoon, I reached a dry creek bed that cut deep into the floor of the canyon. The walls were jagged and the ground uneven. I slid down into it and followed the bend, hoping it would lead to the main trail again. For a while, it did seem promising. There were faint signs of footprints in the sand. But after half a mile, the creek bed split into 3 directions, each one vanishing around tight corners. I picked one at random and kept going. The sun dropped fast. The walls blocked most of its light, and the canyon turned dusky. I stopped to pull on my jacket as the heat left the air. I ate another bar and forced myself to drink sparingly. My mouth was dry no matter how much I sipped. By the time full darkness fell, I was still in the creek bed. I pulled out my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut a narrow path ahead, making the shadows jump against the rock. I had no choice but to keep walking. The canyon at night was different. Every sound seemed louder. A pebble rolling down the wall, the flap of a bat's wings, the dry scrape of brush in the breeze. The silence between those sounds was worse. It was like the canyon swallowed everything. My footsteps echoed back at me, and sometimes I thought I heard a second set behind me, though I knew it was only the sound bouncing. After hours of stumbling through the dark, I admitted I was lost for good. My legs were heavy, my throat burned, and I felt lightheaded. I finally found a flat patch of sand against the wall and sat down. I leaned my pack against the rock and pulled my jacket tight. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something. Rocks shifting, a faint scurry. I kept my flashlight close, flicking it on at the smallest noise. When morning finally came, I was stiff and sore. The canyon was bright again, the walls glowing red with the sunrise. I forced myself to eat another bar and drink half of my second bottle. My water was now dangerously low, and I knew I had to find a way out that day. I decided to climb. The canyon walls weren't smooth everywhere. Some parts had cracks and ledges. I found a section where the wall sloped a little and began to scramble up. My boots slipped on loose rock. My hands scraped against rough stone. But slowly I made it higher. From 30 feet up, I could see over part of the canyon, but not far enough. All I saw were more ridges and bends stretching on. No roads, no trail, no sign of people. Climbing down was harder. I nearly slipped once, sending rocks clattering below, but I caught myself. My hands shook when I reached the bottom again. My strength was fading, and I knew I had wasted precious energy. The next hours were the worst of my life. I wandered through twisting passages, sometimes circling back without realizing it. The heat built again, and the sun glared down whenever the walls opened up. I rationed what was left of my second bottle, but by midday it was nearly gone. My lips cracked, and my head pounded. I began to think about how easily people disappeared out here. Nobody knew exactly where I was. I had signed the register at the trailhead, but that only proved I had started. No one would expect me back until evening. If I didn't make it, I would just be another name lost in the rocks. By late afternoon, I could barely walk straight. My legs dragged and I stumbled often. I finally collapsed in the shade of a boulder, too weak to go farther. I thought about drinking the last few sips of water, but I forced myself to save them for later. I lay there for what felt like hours, the sun sliding across the sky. When I finally pushed myself up again, I noticed something I hadn't before. Faint tire marks in the sand, nearly erased by wind and time. I blinked hard, thinking my eyes were playing tricks, but they were real. The marks led around a bend, faint but visible. I followed them, my heart pounding, each step unsteady. The marks grew clearer the farther I went. Then I saw it, a fence. A simple wooden fence running along the edge of the canyon, half collapsed but real. Beyond it, a dirt road stretched into the desert. I dropped to my knees in relief. I had made it out. It took me another hour to walk along the dirt road, dragging my pack and stopping often to rest. But at last I saw a small service shed with a water tank beside it. The tank had a spigot at the bottom. I turned it and clear water poured out. I cupped my hands and drank until my stomach ached. That night I slept against the shed under the stars, safe at last. In the morning, a park ranger truck came down the road and found me there. They gave me more water and drove me back to the main station. I learned later that I had gone miles off the marked loop into an unmaintained part of the canyon where flash floods sometimes swept through. If I had planned the hike for weeks. It was supposed to be simple. A 3-day trip into the mountains, just me, my backpack, and the trail. I wanted a break from everything. I wanted to hear only the wind in the trees, the crunch of dirt under my boots, and the sound of my own breath. I had done hikes before, nothing extreme, but enough to know how to pack, how to follow maps, and how to pace myself. This trail looked manageable. The map said it wound through forest, climbed along a ridge, passed a couple of small lakes, and looped back. It didn't look dangerous. I left early on a cool morning. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the light was still soft. My backpack felt heavy but balanced, the straps snug against my shoulders. I carried enough food for 3 days, water bottles, a filter, my tent, a sleeping bag, extra clothes, and a first aid kit. I also had my phone, though I already knew service would be unreliable out here. I didn't mind. That was part of the point. The first hours went by easily. The trail was wide and well-worn. It climbed slowly through tall trees, where sunlight filtered in patches through the branches. The forest floor was thick with ferns and moss, and small streams cut across the path. I felt strong, steady, and calm. Each step pushed me farther from the noise of everyday life. By midday, I reached a high point where the trees thinned, and I could see the valley below. It spread out in greens and browns, the river a silver ribbon cutting through it. Behind me, higher peaks rose, sharp and rocky, some still holding streaks of snow. The air was cooler up there, with a stronger wind that carried the smell of stone and pine needles. I ate a quick lunch sitting on a rock. Just trail mix and water, but it tasted better out there. I checked the map again, tracing my finger along the lines. According to it, I'd reach a small lake by late afternoon. I planned to camp there for the night. I felt good, confident, and didn't think about much except moving forward. As the afternoon stretched on, the trail grew rougher. Roots twisted across it, and rocks forced me to watch every step. The incline grew steeper, and I slowed down. The weight of my pack pressed harder against my back. My shirt stuck with sweat, and my legs started to burn. I stopped often, drinking from my water bottle, feeling the cool liquid hit my dry throat. I didn't see anyone else. No hikers, no signs of people. Just birds moving between branches, squirrels darting across fallen logs, and once, the distant sound of something larger moving through brush that I never saw. I tried not to think about it. Animals kept to themselves, usually. The sun tilted lower when I finally reached the lake. It was small, cradled between ridges, the surface still and dark like glass. The trees leaned close around it, and the air was cooler there, almost damp. I dropped my pack on the ground and stretched my shoulders. My body ached, but it was a good ache earned from the climb. I set up my tent a little away from the water, on flat ground where the dirt wasn't too soft. The fabric snapped lightly in the breeze as I pulled it into shape and secured the stakes. Afterward, I filtered water from the lake, crouching at the edge while mosquitoes buzzed around my ears. The water was icy, shocking against my fingers. Dinner was a simple freeze-dried meal, eaten while sitting on a log. The light dimmed, the air cooled, and the sky turned a deeper blue. I felt a quiet satisfaction as I looked at the tent. The fire I had built small but steady, and the lake reflecting the last of the sky. This was what I had wanted: peace, distance, and a kind of simple struggle that felt real. But that night I woke up sweating. At first, I thought it was a dream that had startled me, but I couldn't remember what it was. The tent felt too close, the air inside heavy. I unzipped it to let in a breeze, and the night air was sharp, almost too cold, but it felt better than being trapped inside the fabric. The forest around me was still, too still. No insects, no wind, nothing moving. I sat there listening, my chest tight. Then, faintly, I heard something, a crack, like a stick breaking, far off at first, then another closer. I held my breath, straining my ears. It was probably just an animal, a deer, maybe even something smaller. The forest was full of them. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My skin prickled, and I zipped the tent back up, forcing myself to lie down. My heart thumped for a long time before sleep came again. The next morning, I pushed the unease away. The forest looked harmless in daylight. The sun scattered light through the branches, birds called out, and the lake shimmered gently. I packed my gear, ate a quick breakfast, and started back on the trail. The climb grew steeper. Rocks forced me to scramble with both hands, pulling myself up, my pack shifting awkwardly behind me. Sweat stung my eyes, and every muscle in my legs burned. When I finally reached the ridge, the view was stunning. Peaks stretching endlessly, sharp and jagged, with deep valleys cut between them. But the wind was strong up there, biting and cold, and I couldn't stay long. The trail narrowed along the ridge. One side dropped steep into forest, the other into sheer rock. My boots scuffed loose gravel, sending it skittering down. I moved slow, careful, each step placed with focus. That's when I noticed the trail markers didn't line up with the map anymore. I stopped, checked again, looked around. The path in front of me curved into thicker brush, but it didn't look right. I checked my compass, then the map again, tracing the route. Something was off. I should have turned lower, down by a stream. I had missed it. Somewhere back along the ridge, I had gone the wrong way. My stomach sank. I backtracked a little, scanning the trees and rocks for a marker I might have missed. Nothing. Just forest stretching in all directions. Too many paths that could have been made by animals. The trail under my boots seemed less defined than before. I told myself to stay calm. I knew basic rules. Don't panic, don't keep wandering blindly, and always try to retrace. But as the hours passed, the trail grew less clear, fading into uneven ground. My boots crunched over dry leaves, twigs snapping loud in the silence. The sun moved higher, then slowly began to tilt again. By late afternoon, I had to admit I was lost. Completely. My water was running low, and I hadn't eaten more than a handful of trail mix. I felt heavy, my legs trembling with every step. The forest seemed to close in tighter, the trees pressing together, the ground uneven with hidden holes and roots. I tripped more than once, scraping my hands and knees. At one point, I sat on a fallen log, breathing hard, my chest tight with the start of panic. I forced myself to think. I had a compass. I knew the general direction the main trail looped. If I kept moving west, I might cross it again. I got up and pushed forward. But as the evening deepened, shadows stretched long between the trees. The light grew thin, harder to see. I stumbled more often, catching my foot on hidden rocks. The forest seemed endless, every tree like the last. I needed to stop. I found a small clearing, flat enough to pitch my tent, though the ground was damp. My hands shook as I set it up, the poles rattling against each other. I filtered water from a stream nearby, crouching low and trying not to think about what animals might also come there at night. That night was worse. The sounds returned. Cracks in the darkness, heavy footsteps in brush. At one point, I thought I heard breathing just outside the tent. Low, steady, almost human. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I gripped the small knife I carried, staring at the fabric wall between me and whatever was out there. It never came closer. Eventually, silence returned, but I didn't sleep much. The next day, I felt weak. My legs trembled after only an hour of walking. My pack seemed twice as heavy, straps digging into raw shoulders. My stomach twisted with hunger, but I rationed food, eating only a little at a time. The forest didn't end. I followed the compass west, but the terrain forced me off course. Ravines, thick brush, slopes too steep to climb. I slipped once on wet rocks near a stream and smashed my elbow so hard I saw stars. Pain shot through my arm for hours. By late afternoon, clouds gathered. Dark, heavy. The air felt charged, and the first drops of rain were icy cold. I scrambled to set up my tent before it came down harder, but the storm broke too fast. Sheets of rain pounded, soaking me, the tent, everything. The ground turned to mud. Cold seeped into my bones. I shivered all night, water dripping inside, my clothes clinging wet. The storm raged, wind shaking the thin fabric, thunder rolling over the mountains. I curled tighter in my sleeping bag, teeth chattering so hard my jaw hurt. When morning came, I was exhausted, my body stiff and sore. The forest I had been planning the trip for months, and by the time I finally set off, I felt ready. The idea was simple. Spend a few days hiking through a section of the mountains that I had never explored before. It wasn't far from home, just a few hours by car, but the area was known for being wild, steep, and rough. I wanted something that would push me, something that would feel more serious than the easy trails I was used to. The morning I left, the weather was calm. The forecast showed only mild winds and clear skies. I packed as carefully as I could: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, stove, first aid kit, map, compass, flashlight, extra clothes. My pack felt heavier than usual, but I figured it was better to be ready for anything than to risk running short. I had studied the map enough to know the general route, though I had never walked it myself. The first few hours felt fine. The trail climbed slowly through thick forest, and the smell of pine and damp soil hung heavy in the air. The ground was soft with layers of needles, and every step made a faint crunch. I moved steadily, my breath warm in the cool air. I stopped once in a while to drink or check my map, but mostly I just kept walking. As the day went on, the trail grew steeper. The forest thinned, giving way to stretches of bare rock and loose gravel. I felt the weight of my pack pulling me back as I climbed. My legs burned, but I kept pushing. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a ridge that opened into a wide view of the valley below. The air was colder up here, and the wind had started to pick up. I could see the line of mountains running on and on, sharp against the pale sky. By evening, I found a spot just below the ridge where the ground leveled enough to set my tent. It wasn't perfect, but it was flat enough. I boiled water, ate a quick meal, and crawled inside as the light faded. The night was colder than I expected. The wind never stopped, and I woke several times to the sound of it tearing across the ridge above me. But I stayed put, warm inside my sleeping bag, waiting for morning. The next day, I packed up early and pushed on. The trail grew narrower as it wound along the ridge. On one side, the slope dropped into forest. On the other, the ground fell sharply into rocks and scree. I kept my eyes on the path, careful not to slip. The wind was stronger now, steady and cold, tugging at my jacket and pack. My hands stung from the chill, and I stuffed them into my pockets whenever I stopped. Around midday, the trail led to a section I hadn't expected. It wasn't marked on my map with any warning, but it was clear the route went across a very narrow spine of rock. Both sides dropped steeply, and the path across was no more than a few feet wide. The wind roared over it, rushing so hard I could feel it lifting against my body. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it, weighing whether to try or turn back. I told myself it was just a short stretch. If I moved slowly, kept my balance, and stayed calm, I could make it. I shifted my pack higher on my shoulders, tightened the straps, and stepped onto the narrow section. The rock felt solid under my boots, but the wind was brutal. Each gust made me sway, and I had to crouch slightly, keeping my center low. My heart pounded as I edged forward. The drop on either side was dizzying. Loose pebbles scattered with each step, tumbling away into the void. I kept my eyes on the trail, not daring to look too far out. Step after step, I moved forward, every muscle tense. My legs shook from the effort of balancing against the wind and the weight of the pack. At one point, a stronger gust slammed into me, and I dropped to my hands and knees, gripping the rock until it eased. I stayed there, breathing hard, before forcing myself upright again. The crossing seemed endless, though it couldn't have been more than 100 yards. When I finally reached the other side, I stumbled onto wider ground and sat down hard, my legs weak. I stayed there for a long while, letting the fear bleed away before pushing on again. The trail on the far side wasn't much better. It climbed steeply, twisting along bare rock faces. The wind followed me, never letting up, and by late afternoon, clouds began to gather. The light dimmed, the sky turning gray. I checked my map, but it wasn't much use here. The lines and marks told me where the ridge went, but the reality of the terrain was harder. I pressed on, hoping to find a place to camp before the weather worsened. It didn't come. The ridge stretched on, narrow and exposed, with no flat ground in sight. The clouds thickened, and soon the first flakes of snow began to fall. The wind carried them sideways, stinging my face. Panic crept into me. I hadn't planned for snow, not this early in the season. I needed shelter, but there was none. As the snow fell heavier, the trail vanished under a thin layer of white. I could barely see my boots. The rocks grew slick, and I slipped more than once, catching myself just in time. My gloves were soaked, my hands numb. Every breath felt like ice in my chest. Finally, I spotted a shallow cut in the ridge, just wide enough to crouch in. It wasn't much, but it broke the wind. I dropped my pack, dragged out my tent, and tried to set it up. My fingers shook too badly to manage the poles. The wind ripped at the fabric, nearly tearing it from my grip. After several tries, I gave up and crawled into the collapsed fabric, wrapping it around me with my sleeping bag. I spent the night like that, half buried under snow, shivering. I barely slept. Every time the wind screamed louder, I expected the whole ridge to break apart under me. By morning, the storm had eased, but the world was buried in white. I forced myself up, packed as best I could, and started moving again. The trail was gone. Everything looked the same, snow-covered rock, no marks, no signs. I tried to follow the ridge, but I had no idea if I was staying on track. The cold ate at me with every step. Hours passed like that, I stumbled, fell, got up again. My water was nearly gone, and the snow I tried to melt in my mouth only chilled me further. My legs felt hollow, my hands useless. I started to wonder if I had made a mistake too big to fix. Then, late in the day, I saw something. Faint tracks in the snow, human boot prints. They led down a slope, away from the ridge. I followed them, hoping they would lead somewhere safer. The descent was steep and dangerous, but I didn't care. I slid more than walked, clawing at rocks to slow myself. At the bottom, the tracks vanished into trees, and I realized I had dropped into the forest again. The wind was weaker here, the snow thinner under the trees. I kept moving, though my body felt like it could collapse at any moment. Not long after, I spotted smoke curling between the trees. I followed it, stumbling through drifts, until I reached a small wooden cabin tucked against the slope. My relief was so strong it made me dizzy. I staggered up to it, banged on the door, and when it opened, I nearly fell inside. I had made it. That night, I sat by the cabin's fire, shaking from cold and exhaustion, knowing how close I had come to not making it out. The ridge had been worse than I imagined. Narrower, steeper, and crueler with the storm. I realized how thin the line was between adventure and disaster, and how easy it was to cross it. When I finally left the mountains days later, I carried the memory of that ridge with me. The sight of the drop, the force of the wind, the whiteout of snow, those things never left. I had gone looking for challenge, and I found it, but it came at a cost I would never forget. I knew then that no matter how much I prepared, the mountains would always be stronger, and I would always be small against them. I have always liked the quiet of the woods. Hiking had been something I did on weekends when I wanted to escape the noise of daily life. I was not new to it, but I was not an expert either. I kept myself in shape, packed my gear carefully, and usually stuck to marked trails. I liked being alone out there because I felt it helped me clear my mind. That day, I thought I was just going for another hike, but it turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. It started with a plan that was supposed to be simple. I wanted to do a day hike in an area I had read about online. It was a trail that wasn't as popular as the others, but still listed as accessible. The write-up said the trail was about 12 miles in total, looping through thick forests, some ridges, and crossing a couple of streams. People said the trail markers were not always clear, but I didn't think much of it. I had done trails longer than that before. I told myself I would start early and be back by evening. I left my car at the small dirt parking area around 8 in the morning. The air was cool, damp, and smelled like wet leaves. It had rained the night before, so everything looked fresh and darkened by water. The ground was soft, and my boots sank slightly with each step. I had a backpack with water, snacks, a basic first aid kit, a flashlight, a map printout, and a knife I always carried when hiking. I also had an extra sweater tied to the bottom of my pack. I checked my phone, and as expected, there was no service. I put it on airplane mode to save battery. The trail began wide and easy, cutting through tall trees that blocked most of the sky. It was quiet, with only the sound of dripping water from branches and the occasional distant bird call. My steps echoed more than usual in the damp woods. I moved steadily, enjoying the peace. After the first mile or so, the path narrowed and started winding more. There were small wooden posts with faded paint marking the trail, though some of them were tilted or nearly hidden under bushes. As I walked, I noticed the forest here felt heavier than other places I had hiked. The trees grew close together, their trunks tall and their tops thick with leaves. The undergrowth was messy with ferns, fallen logs, and tangled branches. There weren't many clearings, just walls of green and brown. I kept going, following the trail as best I could, checking my map from time to time. The map wasn't detailed, but it showed the general loop. After about 3 hours, I had covered what I thought was nearly half of the loop. I stopped by a small stream to drink some water and eat. The stream was shallow, moving slowly over smooth stones, with clear water that reflected the green around it. I sat on a rock, listening to the trickling sound, and felt calm. I thought about how much time I had left and figured I would be done by late afternoon. When I continued, I noticed the ground got steeper, leading up toward a ridge. The trail was faint, just dirt pressed down by past hikers. Fallen leaves covered much of it, making it harder to see. I kept checking for markers, but some stretches didn't have any. I would look back often, making sure I remembered what the return would look like, though in the back of my mind I reminded myself this was a loop, not an out and back. It was near the ridge that I made a mistake. The path split in two, but there was no sign. Both directions looked like they could be part of the trail. I hesitated, studied my map, and convinced myself the left fork was correct. I followed it, and at first it felt right, going uphill as I expected. But after 20 minutes, the trail became less clear, the dirt turning to patches of grass and loose stones. I saw no posts or markings. I told myself to stay calm. I retraced my steps back down to where the split had been. But when I got there, something didn't look the same. I couldn't find the exact spot where the fork began. Everything looked like overlapping paths made by animals or runoff from rain. My chest tightened as I turned in circles, trying to match the view with what I remembered. I picked what I thought was the other path, walking carefully, hoping it would rejoin the loop. It took me deeper into dense woods where the ground was uneven and cluttered with roots. After another half hour, I was sure I had gone the wrong way again. I hadn't seen a trail marker in a long time, and the faint dirt line had almost disappeared under leaves. I stopped, breathing harder, and tried to control the panic rising inside me. I checked my phone again, still no service. The map printout was simple, showing only the loop, no side trails or details about terrain. I realized how unhelpful it was now. I decided to keep moving in one direction rather than wandering randomly. If I kept a steady line, I might cut across the trail again. So I marked a tree with my knife, slicing a clean line in its bark, and walked straight ahead, making similar marks every few minutes. The forest was silent except for the sound of my own movement. The silence began to feel heavier, as if the trees were pressing in. Time moved slowly. The sun barely showed through the canopy, but I could tell it was shifting west. My stomach was tight with hunger, though I ate some of my snacks while walking. Sweat ran down my back even though the air was cool. I kept expecting to see a marker, a sign, or even the sound of running water, but nothing came. By late afternoon, I knew I was lost. I had walked for hours without finding the trail. My legs were sore, my water was running low, and the thought of nightfall filled me with dread. I stopped near a fallen tree and sat, forcing myself to think clearly. I could not wander in panic. I needed to prepare for the night. I gathered some branches and leaves to make a small shelter against the log. I put on my sweater, ate the last of my snacks, and sipped the little water I had left. The woods grew darker as the light faded. The sounds changed too. There were distant cracks of branches, soft rustles in the leaves, and once, a sharp snap that made me freeze. Every noise felt close, though I could not see what made them. When full darkness came, I turned on my flashlight. The beam cut through the trees, but only showed more trunks and shadows. I sat under my makeshift cover, knife in my hand, heart beating hard. The night stretched endlessly. I did not sleep, just sat listening, staring into the blackness. The scariest part was how alone I felt. I knew no one could hear me if I shouted. I thought about people at home not knowing where I was. The fear of being completely cut off was worse than any sound in the woods. When morning finally came, I felt weak and drained. My throat was dry, and I knew I needed water soon. I pushed on, moving slower than before. Around midday, I finally heard something that lifted me. A faint trickle of water. I followed the sound and came to a small stream. I crouched down and drank, the cold water soothing and giving me strength. I filled my empty bottle too. I decided to follow the stream. Streams often led to larger rivers, and rivers often had roads or settlements nearby. It was the best chance I had. The path along the stream was rough, with slippery rocks and thick brush, but it gave me direction. I marked trees less often now, focusing on just keeping the water in sight. Hours passed, and the forest thinned slightly. I saw more sunlight reaching the ground. The stream widened, and I noticed signs of animals. Prints in the mud, broken branches. That scared me in a different way because it meant larger wildlife was around. I kept my knife close, though I knew it wouldn't help much if something bigger came at me. By the second night, exhaustion was heavy on me. I built another crude shelter near the stream, shivering as the air cooled again. I had no food left, just water. Hunger gnawed at me, making me lightheaded. I lay awake, listening to the forest again, every crack of a branch making me grip the knife tighter. I thought about how a single mistake had led me here. I thought about how easily the woods swallowed people. The next morning, I forced myself to keep going. My body ached, but I had no choice. The stream grew stronger, and by afternoon I noticed something that made my chest leap. Cut logs stacked neatly by the water. It was the first clear sign of human activity. I followed further, and soon I saw a rough wooden bridge crossing the stream. It was old but solid. On the other side, a narrow dirt road stretched through the trees. Relief crashed over me so strong I almost fell to my knees. I followed the road, stumbling, until after what felt like forever, I saw a small cabin and then another. It was a cluster of hunting cabins, empty now but clear proof that people used the area. From there, I knew I was saved. The road would lead me out. I walked until my legs barely worked, and just before dusk, I reached a wider gravel path where a parked truck sat. No one was around, but the sight of it was enough. I knew the gravel path would eventually connect to a main road. I pushed forward, driven by the thought of safety. By nightfall, I finally saw headlights in the distance, a sign of the highway. When I stepped onto the pavement, cars rushing past, I felt more human than I had in days. My body was weak, my clothes torn and dirty. I had planned the hike for months, circling the date on my calendar and slowly gathering the gear I would need. I had done plenty of trails before, but most were shorter loops or day hikes near towns. This one was different. It was an isolated trail that wound through miles of forest, up into ridges where you could see nothing but green hills stretching in every direction. The idea of being that far from roads and houses pulled me in. I wanted silence, space, and the kind of challenge that made you feel small against the land. The morning I set out, the air was cool, the kind that made each breath feel sharp. My pack was heavier than I liked, stuffed with food, water, sleeping gear, and a small emergency kit. I parked my car at the lot near the trailhead, checked the straps on everything twice, and walked onto the path that disappeared into the trees. The sun was only just breaking through, long slants of light catching on the trunks. I told myself it would be just another hike, only longer. Still, I felt a flicker of nerves, the kind you get when you know you are stepping into a place where you will have to rely only on yourself. The trail was clear at first, wide enough to walk easily. Roots knuckled up from the dirt, and the occasional stone forced me to watch my footing, but the walking was easy. Birds started up once the sun rose higher, echoing in bursts across the canopy. I fell into a rhythm, one foot in front of the other, the steady pull of the pack straps across my shoulders, the sound of my breathing sinking with each step. Hours passed this way. The trail grew narrower as it climbed. The ground softened from layers of fallen pine needles, muffling my boots. I stopped now and then to sip water, leaning my back against trees, feeling the sweat cool on my neck. By midday, I had made it farther than I expected, but the air was changing. It grew heavier, as if the forest itself thickened around me. The canopy overhead closed tighter, letting in less light. I kept going, but I noticed how quickly the trail seemed to shift. One section would be soft dirt, another tangled with rocks, another slick with moss. I had to keep my eyes on the ground constantly, careful not to twist an ankle. The silence deepened too. Bird calls grew fewer. The only sound became my boots and the faint rub of the pack straps. By late afternoon, my legs were sore, and I started to think about where to stop for the night. I had planned to set up camp somewhere off the trail, a small clearing if I could find one. That was when I realized how different this trail felt from the others I'd been on. Normally, clearings or flat spots appeared often, places where other hikers had stopped before. Here, the forest pressed close. The undergrowth was thick, thorny, and uneven. Every patch of ground seemed either slanted or choked with roots. I pushed on, thinking I'd find something better farther along. The trail narrowed again until it was no more than a faint line cutting through brush. I checked my map, tracing the dotted line with my finger. I should have been near a ridge that looked like it might open up. But when I reached it, I found only more trees, the path sloping downward instead of up. The light was thinning by then. I hadn't realized how fast the day had gone. The forest floor was already dim, shadows stretching and mixing together until the ground looked uneven in ways I couldn't read. I had no choice but to stop. I found a small space beside the trail that was just flat enough for my tent. Clearing it took effort. I dragged branches aside, kicked at loose stones, and stomped the ground flat. When I finally set my tent, I felt an odd relief, as if having those thin walls around me meant I had made a place of my own. Cooking was simple, one of the meal packs I had brought, heated over a small stove. The sound of water boiling was oddly loud in the quiet. I ate fast, more out of nerves than hunger, and packed everything away. When darkness fell fully, it was absolute. No glow from distant towns. No moon that I could see through the thick canopy. I clicked on my headlamp, the beam cutting a narrow tunnel of light. Beyond that, only black. That was when I felt it. A shift in the air, almost like the forest itself had moved closer. I kept telling myself it was only because I was tired, that my senses were sharper because I was alone. But it felt like the trees were pressing in, waiting. I crawled into my tent, zipped the flap, and lay still. Every crack of a twig outside jolted me. My heartbeat seemed too loud in my own ears. I tried to tell myself it was just animals, squirrels, raccoons, maybe a deer, but the steps I heard seemed slower, more deliberate, as if something was pacing. I barely slept that night. I must have dozed in short stretches, but every time I woke it was with a jolt, staring into the fabric of the tent, listening hard. When morning finally came, I felt heavy and drained. I packed fast, stuffing the tent and gear into my bag. I wanted to keep moving, to put distance between me and that spot. The trail grew worse as I went. Sections crumbled at the edges, where the dirt gave way into steep drops. I had to place each step carefully. At one point, the path tilted so sharply that I had to press myself against the slope, fingers clawing at roots for balance. My pack felt like it was pulling me sideways, ready to send me tumbling. By midday, my legs shook with every climb. Sweat soaked through my shirt, stinging my eyes. I stopped at a stream to refill water, crouching low, cupping the cold liquid in my hands. As I drank, I felt it again, that sense of being watched. I froze, droplets running down my chin, and turned my head slowly. The trees stood still, thick trunks lined in rows. But the feeling didn't leave. I scanned the undergrowth, the brush, the shadows. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the weight of it. I stood, fastened the cap on my bottle, and hurried back to the trail. My heart beat harder than it should have from just crouching at a stream. The hours dragged. The forest seemed endless, each turn of the trail revealing only more of the same. By late afternoon, my body was near its limit. My knees ached, and my shoulders throbbed under the straps. But worse than that was the building fear that I was losing track of where I was. The trail markers grew fewer. At times I wasn't sure if I was still on the right path or just following a game trail that cut away. I checked my map and compass again and again, tracing lines, trying to match landmarks. But the forest blurred together, one ridge looking much like another. That evening, when I finally found a flat enough spot to stop, I could barely lift my arms to set the tent. I forced myself to eat something, though every bite turned to paste in my mouth. As night fell, the same fear crept in. Only this time it felt sharper, closer. The sounds outside my tent came quicker. Snaps of branches, faint scuffs in the dirt. I barely slept again. The next day, I knew I had to make a choice. Keep going forward on a trail I wasn't sure about, or turn back and try to retrace my steps. Both felt dangerous. My food was running lower than I liked, and I had no idea how far I really was from the end. I chose to keep going. The trail led me into a stretch where the trees thinned and the land dropped sharply on one side. The path narrowed until it was barely wide enough for my boots. To my left, a steep slope plunged down, covered in loose rock. To my right, the hill rose sharply, slick with moss. I tried to move carefully, planting each step, but my body was so tired that my balance faltered. At one point, my foot slid on gravel, and I went down hard on one knee, my pack pulling me toward the edge. I clawed at the dirt, heart hammering, until I steadied myself. I sat there for a long time, breathing hard, staring down at the drop. If I slipped, no one would ever know where I had gone. That thought stayed with me the rest of the day. The forest closed in again after the ridge. The light dimmed, even though it wasn't yet evening. My legs moved like they were made of stone, but I kept pushing. I couldn't shake the thought of stopping in the wrong place, of something coming too close in the dark. When I finally stumbled into a small clearing with a rotted log across it, I dropped my pack and sat hard. My whole body trembled. That night, I didn't even set the tent. I sat with my back against the log, my sleeping bag wrapped around me, my headlamp on. I kept it shining at the tree line, sweeping it back and forth. My eyes burned from not blinking. Every shadow looked like it was leaning closer. I lasted until maybe midnight before exhaustion dragged me under. When I woke, my lamp was off. The forest around me was silent. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. My pack was still beside me, my gear untouched. But the ground in front of me had faint prints pressed into the dirt. Not boots, not shoes, bare, human. I stared at them until my vision blurred. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't breathe enough air. I packed as fast as I could at dawn, hands shaking so badly I dropped things twice. I didn't care about neatness. I just wanted to move. The trail ahead twisted endlessly. My body screamed with each step, but I kept going. Hours blurred